All right, let's get right into it. In this explainer, we're going to break down the teachings of Elder Michael Johnson, which describe a kind of spiritual battleground for the human mind, a concept he calls the matrix.
So let me ask you something. What if every single thought you have, every little motive, every conclusion you come to, what if it wasn't just in your head? What if it was all evidence being presented in a cosmic trial, a trial that shapes your entire reality?
Well, that's exactly the idea we're digging into today. This teaching lays out a framework for a spiritual courtroom where our reasoning gets put on the stand measured against an unchanging absolute standard. And this whole concept, this courtroom, that's the matrix. To really get a handle on this, you have to understand that, according to this teaching, there's a huge conflict going on. It's a choice between two completely different spiritual frameworks, or you could say two different matrices. So on one side, you've got JEHOVAH's holy matrix. This is where your reasoning is shaped by eternal, unchangeable precepts. But on the other side, there's the world's matrix, and that one is built on human traditions, philosophies, and what the source calls counterfeit signals, basically things designed to confuse you. So let's be super clear. When we talk about the matrix here, we're not talking about a movie. Think of it more as a spiritual and judicial chamber. It's a metaphorical courtroom of your mind where every single thought is exposed and weighed against the perfect standards of JEHOVAH. A good way to think about this is like tuning a radio. To really operate in JEHOVAH's matrix, you have to be locked into his frequency, a signal that's described as pure and totally uncorrupted. Everything else, it's just static. It's noise, counterfeit signals, and worldly confusion designed to jam that clear channel.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting. This teaching takes a hard look at a lot of established religious institutions, and it frames them not as places of truth, but, well, as a kind of spiritual prison.
This quote from Jeremiah 2:13 really sums up the whole argument. The teaching says that by relying on man-made religious systems, people are turning away from the direct fountain of living waters, and instead choosing broken cisterns, systems that might look like they hold truth, but in the end, they're empty. And this is what the source calls spiritual Babylon. It's the name given to these institutional systems that are seen as trapping believers, making them dependent on human leaders and ultimately blocking any kind of direct line to JEHOVAH. It's kind of like the difference between spiritual milk and spiritual meat. The teaching says institutions often just provide the milk, basic lessons that keep people in a state of dependency. But the meat, that deep, mature wisdom, can only come directly from JEHOVAH. So if institutional religion is seen as a trap, then what's the way out? Well, the teaching lays out a very specific escape route, a journey out of this bondage and into a place it calls the wilderness. The call to action is incredibly direct, pulling straight from Revelation 18:4. Come out of her, my people. And this is interpreted as a direct command to leave the systems of spiritual Babylon, to make a kind of spiritual exodus. Now, this wilderness they talk about, it's crucial to understand it's not a physical place. It's a spiritual state of being. It's a place of freedom where you're supposedly fed directly by JEHOVAH, with no human gatekeepers or religious structures in the way. But this journey, it doesn't happen overnight. According to these teachings, there's a very precise timeline for this whole transformation from being a spiritual infant to a mature adult. And that timeline is exactly 1,260 days. This number, which lines up with 3.5 prophetic years, is presented as the set-in-stone cycle for complete spiritual development. This period is then broken down into 3 phases. The first 420 days are all about weaning you off that institutional milk. Then the next phase is about direct instruction from JEHOVAH on something called butter and honey, which represents deeper wisdom. And that final phase, that's when you reach spiritual adulthood, able to tell good from evil all on your own. Using a quote from Isaiah 7:15, the teaching explains that this whole process, eating this butter and honey, is what gives you true spiritual maturity. The entire point is to get to a place where you don't need an institution to tell you what's right or wrong. You just know. Now, the teaching also gets into the idea of order and purity, and it extends this into some very specific interpretations. It's important that we present this next part exactly as it's described in the source material we're analyzing. The scriptural foundation for this part comes from verses like Leviticus 19:19, which forbids the mixing of different kinds of livestock, seeds, or even fabrics.
So, based on those verses, the source material argues that any mingling of the boundaries set by Jehovah is a major spiritual rebellion. And this interpretation goes beyond just farming. It's applied to spiritual purity, like mixing truth with human traditions, and also what the source calls genetic purity, using the term hybridization to refer to the mixing of races.
And according to this teaching, the consequences of crossing these boundaries, whether they're spiritual or genetic, are severe. It's believed to lead directly to chaos, confusion, disease, and a total break from the harmony of Jehovah's order. Which brings us to the final choice. The teaching basically frames this entire spiritual path as a journey of personal accountability, and it all comes down to a single, massive decision that every person has to make for themselves. And that path to accountability has 3 pretty clear steps. First, you have to examine your own motives. Are you seeking knowledge to puff yourself up or to be obedient? Second, you have to reject the pride that this teaching says blinds so many people. And finally, you have to make an active choice, transformation over tradition. And so, at the end of the day, it all boils down to the core question this teaching poses. It asks every single person to decide which matrix is going to define their reality, the comfortable prison of spiritual captivity, or the challenging, open road to what it calls freedom with Jehovah.